It's a beautiful day in Sartell. I don't know about the rest of the county, but it's nice out here.
Yeah, it's a lot warmer today.
Jeff Mergen, mine working?
Yes, we can hear you. Good afternoon.
You.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Deb. All right, we'll go ahead and get the meeting started. It is 3:30. So welcome. My name is Becky Schlorf. I'm an environmental services supervisor and I oversee the feedlot program. And welcome you to the Ordinance Review Committee meeting of February 22nd, 2021, where we will be discussing the proposed ordinance changes for feedlots and subsurface sewage treatment systems and holding tanks. I will go ahead and do the roll call next. So I'll start with the County Board of Commissioners. Commissioner Clark. I don't see her or hear her. Commissioner Persky.
Here.
Commissioner Mergen.
Here.
Commissioner Lensmeyer.
Here.
Commissioner Notch.
Here.
Thank you. And then the Planning Commission members, Jason Wienerman. I think we heard from him he was not going to be attending and I don't see him on. Sean Blackburn. I don't see him on and I don't hear him. Jason Cohn.
I'm here.
Great. I hear you as well. Thank you. Ken Mossman.
Here.
All right. Mike Prohl.
Here.
Rich Blankish.
Here.
And Jeff Bertram.
Here.
All right. Great. Thank you. So this is the 5th of 7 meetings. Do any of you have any questions? All right. For review of any of the members of the public that may be watching, these ordinance review meetings are being held to implement the comprehensive plan that was adopted last July. The zoning updates are an implementation tool for the policy area recommendations of the plan, and the plan can be viewed at shapestearns.com. And I do just see now Sean Blackburn Blackburn is on, so we'll mark him as attending. Today's meeting is covering feedlots and, as I said before, the SSTS, or holding tanks, and Mark Lateral is on and will be presenting that last item. So first, we'll start with feedlots. The meeting goals, basically with feedlots, is to provide a recommendation to the commissioners regarding the feedlot ordinance changes. Goal 2 there is for the SSTS. So, and then this is just a reminder that your next meeting is scheduled for March 29th, and that will be the subdivision requirement in mining operations. So for feedlots, you have the 5 pillars in the comp plan, and obviously this one is tied most closely to the agricultural pillar. And then in the agricultural use and animal agriculture policies, those 2 areas, item number 2 in the agricultural use reads, emphasize the importance of animal agriculture to the county economy by treating it as a priority land use in the area compared with residential or other agricultural uses, other non-agricultural uses, I'm sorry. And then under the animal agriculture policies in the plan, it states for number 1, allow animal feedlots in the agricultural areas by protecting them from non-farm housing through county zoning. And I'm highlighting those because one of the implementation items in the comp plan that many of you may remember from some of the discussion is a recommendation for section 6.7.5 on animal feedlot setbacks to review and revisit that setback and look at a reduction. So with what's typical with ordinance changes is that for feedlots at least, we take it to the feedlot review committee and let them discuss it and bring forth a recommendation that then goes to the Planning Commission. This time around, we also brought it before the Board of Adjustment. And so both of these committees did make a unanimous recommendation, 3 of them in fact. One is to reduce the residential feedlot residential dwelling setback to 500 feet. Currently it is at 700. And then 2 is to make an exception to the feedlot residential dwelling setback requirement when there is a common owner. And then 3 is to alter the animal unit density in the agricultural zoning districts for parcels less than 10 acres. And I'll go into more detail with a chart later. So just a little bit of background here. The feedlot ordinance first went into effect in Stearns County in September of 1998. And that was actually before countywide zoning. So about a year and a half later then, countywide zoning went into effect. And so at that time, the 700-foot setback to a residential dwelling went into effect. So for the year and a half prior, the county did have a tiered setback. And then on December 31st, 2001, the feedlot registration deadline occurred. So that established many of the legal nonconformities that we have for feedlots. So those that did register by that deadline essentially are what we term sometimes as grandfathered in, which is basically a legal nonconformity. So today the sections in the ordinance that are basically being touched on are 6.7.5 and 6.7.6. And so just to remember that the feedlot setbacks typically apply for feedlots that are 10 animal units or more in an agricultural district, a T20, or an urban expansion zoning district. So I'm going to go over the feedlot setbacks first. And a couple of points to remember here is that in section 5 of the ordinance, which covers nonconformities, it does allow a one-time encroachment of 24 feet. And that is for either the feedlot, so if they want to build a lean-to or a small addition, or the home, or both actually. So for the home, it would be maybe a garage or a porch or a deck. They do not need a variance. They can get that one-time 24-foot to go closer to the feedlot or to the house, and we track that in our system. So in essence, it could be a 48 feet if you add both the feedlot and both the residential dwelling. Take advantage of that. it would be 48 feet total. And then in section 6, we do have a conditional use permit requirement that kicks in at the time of a feedlot becoming 700 animal units or more, or one that is already at that level and wanting to modify or expand. So that's just a reminder. It did come up when the two other committees were discussing the potential tiered setback, because a conditional use permit can help address any concerns for odor or nuisance odors rather with the feedlot expansion. And then there is a Minnesota state statute that does require reciprocal setbacks in ag districts for new feedlots and new residential dwellings. And so as you all probably realize, the state statute overrides the county ordinance. And you have in your packet a lot of statistics and data. The staff went through the variance data that we have related to feedlots, and also in particular the setback for a residential dwelling. And we looked at 2 7-year time frames. And so the first time period that we looked at was from January 2014 to December 2020. There were a total of 55 feedlot-related variances, and 39 of those related to the residential dwelling setback. So that's 71%. 5% were denied. In the prior 7-year time frame, so that was beginning in 2008, there were a total of 25 feedlot variances, and 16 of those, or 64%, were related to this residential setback. And in that case, there were actually 25% denied. Also, to get some perspective, there were 674 permits issued in the first 7-year time frame, the most recent 7-year time frame. So that would be about, and then 18 variances requested for the residential setback. So that's 2.7% of all feedlot permits that were issued had a residential setback variance. And then we also are going to be talking about the common ownership piece. And so of the 39 variances related to the residential setback, 7 of them did have a common owner involved. And then also the Board of Adjustment at times will put conditions on the variances that they do grant. So 8 of all 55 variances that were issued did include a condition, and 7 of those were related to that residential setback. And then you can see here in the prior 7-year period, there were 4 of 12 variances that did have a common owner, and none of them did have that condition, have conditions related to it. So,
I want to ask you a question here as we're talking about residential setbacks.
Yes.
When we talk about residential setbacks, are we talking only about the property owner? Or are we talking also potentially for the neighbor? Is there a difference between the owner of the property and the neighbor?
So if you're asking if the residence is on the same parcel, there's no setback for that.
Okay.
If the feedlot owner and their house is on the same parcel, there is no setback. It's only to a neighbor, or it is in the case, basically if the property is not on the same deed, then it needs to meet the setback. So that's why when the recommendation was made for a common owner was if there, and we'll get into this next, that there would be an exception.
And then is the setback to the dwelling or to the property line of a neighbor?
It's to the dwelling, or components of the dwelling. So we do have a property line setback already. So this is just with respect to the dwelling structure. And that could mean in a garage if it's attached, a deck if it's attached, a porch, any attached part of that residential dwelling.
Okay, I got a couple questions. You know, Persky always asks questions. So the other question would be, what about a setback then from a well?
The state regulates the well setback. So the Minnesota Department of Health regulates the well setbacks, but when we do review the feedlot permit applications, we are looking at those and issuing permits only when it does meet. So that's beyond the scope of the ordinance, unless the county board does want to be more restrictive than the Minnesota Department of Health.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Becky, Jeff Bertram, I may be dreaming, but I could have swore that property owners, their homes had to have setbacks of the feedlot too. That never was the case?
Are you asking about a residential dwelling when they build? Do they need to be set back from the property line?
Like if a farmer themselves built a house on the farm, they have to meet the setbacks.
Not if it's on the same deed.
And maybe that's what it was. Maybe it was if it was a different parcel. But I remember dealing with many farmers that were building a house on their farm that had to meet the setback. So it must have been on a different parcel then, because many farms have multiple parcels. Well,
in recent years, I would say there have been more splits we've heard of. I mean, we don't always know why they're splitting, but in some cases for financial reasons. And so for perhaps maybe lending purposes, they're wanting to split off the home from the feedlot. I don't know if those are the situations that you may have been thinking of, where it was on the same parcel and then they're coming in for a variance so that they can split it. I don't know does that sound familiar? I'm not sure. I just what I do remember, and that could be part of it. It was a financial reason for a mortgage or something. But I just remember that there were existing farmers that had to meet the setbacks, which I didn't think was totally bad, because of course what happens is a lot of these farmers will build a home and then within 20 years, suddenly somebody else bought that house. So the house was originally occupied and owned by the farmer, or most often the older farmer, and then they sold the farm to the younger child, and then they built the house. Well, then of course in 20 years, they're no longer in that house, and then somebody else is in the house. Well, now if you didn't do the setbacks, now there's somebody in the house that isn't complying with the setbacks of a home that was built. I just remember there was a lot of caveats to that and a lot of different variations that potentially created problems, both for the farmer not being able to build their house on their farm that they farmed their entire life, and then the flip side of it, having someone else buying the house and then suddenly being closer to a feedlot than what they wanted and creating problems. But we'll probably get into that. On page 3, Becky, you've got the Feedlot Review Committee recommendations. You said the Board of Adjustment also reviewed it. Did they have any recommendations? Yep, in the previous slide here, that packet that you have is from a little over a month ago. So I did update things here today for you. And as I said, yeah, the Board of Adjustment had the same unanimous recommendation as the Feedlot Review Committee.
Got it. Yep, you're right. I'm going by our packet. If it is in the information that we got, maybe next time it would help if you wouldn't send it out quite so far ahead, then we have the same information. But if it is in the packet we received, if you can reference the page, that would be helpful. And then I don't know if we should talk about, on that page 3, it talks about to make an exception when there is a common owner. So what's a common owner?
Yep.
The farmer would be the same. I want to make sure and understand the dynamics of it.
Yeah. Would it be okay with you if I just proceed with the residential dwelling setback slides I have, and then we'll jump right into that? It's all somewhat related.
We can go back. Too bad.
So if the setback were reduced to the 500 feet as recommended by the 2 other committees, the impact on the last 7 years and then the 7 years prior to that would have been that 19 variances would not have been needed. 11 of those were the residents requiring or asking it to the feedlot, and 8 were the feedlot to the residents. And then the prior 7 years was only 1 variance that would not have been needed. And then when we're comparing to other counties, Stearns County, Morrison County is an example. They have somewhat more and less restrictive than Stearns County is currently. And then you can see a few others are already less restrictive. And that has changed over the years too, because I remember doing this survey many years ago, and Stearns County was one of the less restrictive with 700-foot setback. And then I have as an example, a visual here if you would like. This is one of the variances that did come through within the last 7 years. It is a 10-acre or more parcel. So when there are a 10-acre or more, there's no animal unit density requirement. And so they're just looking to make sure setbacks are met. In this case, the residential setback was not met. It was only at 658 feet. It's zoned A40. And the site had been deactivated for the purpose of splitting the parcel. And then later, I think maybe due to some ownership changes, there was a desire to reactivate. So upon reactivation, it was no longer meeting the setback, and the variance was applied for and granted. So we can go back to that for future discussion if needed here. Jumping back into that common owner exception, this would be in cases where there was the same, at least one person or entity is the full or partial owner of each parcel. And that's the language that I'm going to propose to make it very clear, because the term common owner or common, I looked it up when someone was asking questions of us, and I think this new language right here is going to be a little bit better and more clear without having to go in and add a definition. And so the Feedlot Review Committee and Board of Adjustment did look at these two sub-items here as well. Should it apply to livestock? Because in some situations, someone owns the livestock but may not have ownership of either parcel. And the answer was they felt that that should not be the case. They were thinking it should just be the ownership of the parcel. And then the second sub-bullet item there is that it does create a potential loophole, as you were suggesting, Jeff, I think, where, you know, if an individual owns or is part owner of both parcels, they can essentially split without a variance and then just sell it off right away or 20 years later. So. And then comparing to other counties, so we're looking here at the third column. And I can, I guess, maybe point to that to be more clear. So in our nearby counties, none of them really have this exception except for Candy-Ojai County. But as you could see in your packet, which let me find that page number, there was a survey of other county, statewide of counties, and there were several that did have exceptions. In fact, exceptions beyond even what's being currently proposed for the ordinance change here. And let's see, that would be packet page 9. The survey was done back in May of 2019, and there were 23 counties that did respond. 16 of them had a same owner exemption or exception rather. And then some others had, if it was a family owner, a family member of the owner, a couple even had a feedlot employee. So let me get back to the example that I have for you here is, oh, yep.
I was just going to ask, do you know if those counties were counties where they have large animal agriculture? I think they were in southern Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't have that readily available at this time. I could get that information, but we just surveyed around the state, and I just know that in nearby counties, most of them don't have the exception at this time.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think it was a lot of our southern counties where there's larger feedlots.
So this example is one from recent years. It is zoned A40. You can see in the golden color are the proposed feedlot structures. The black lines are showing the variance request. And you might see different owners here, but they were there was a common owner involved with the shortest distance here. And then the longest distance. So if this proposed ordinance change were to go through, this situation obviously would still need the variance because of a non-common owner with that south setback there. I will say too, one of the things that I noticed in the data as well is that most of the variances, the vast majority of the variances that had the greatest deviation also had a common owner. And so, like I mentioned, you know, when you're seeing some of these splits that are happening, obviously the home is going to be closer. So that makes sense. I guess before I jump into the animal unit density piece, does anyone want to raise some questions, concerns, or have some discussion at this point?
Becky, Commissioner Notch here. I'm going to ask a question related to these what Jeff was probably alluding to before. So if on a farm property, the older generation wants to build another house on a parcel, now the existing farm site is, let's say it's a dairy farm and they're operating. Now let's say the dairy shuts down, so the feedlot's not active anymore. Now the other farm dwelling, which might be closer to the feedlot now, or a feedlot maybe that's been retired. So now if they want to start that feedlot up again, and that house is, let's say, 450 feet away, will they need a variance to start the feedlot again?
Yes, if the feedlot has been deactivated, it would, upon reactivation, it would have to meet all setbacks.
Okay, so they'd have to go through like a variance and whatnot, all this.
Right, because it would no longer be considered a legal nonconformity. Once it becomes deactivated, the purpose of deactivation is so that then it opens up for others because the use has been discontinued. And then, of course, the purpose of reactivation is to make sure things become conforming. So yes, in that situation, it would require a variance.
Okay, thanks.
At this time with the current ordinance.
Hey, Becky, Jason Crone, and just a clarification question. So if I'm interpreting, so Minnesota statute 394.25 subdivision 3C, okay, it says it requires the same distances and conditions for new residents and feedlot setbacks in areas zoned agricultural. So what that's in essence saying is that if you want to build or you want to put a new animal unit in, you're limited to 700 feet from a residence. But likewise, if there's an existing animal or a feedlot that exists with whatever the animal units are, and you want to build a new home on your property, but you're within that 700 feet, you have the same restrictions. You'd need a variance in order to do that, correct?
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
I just wanted to make sure I was interpreting that right, that it goes both ways.
Yep.
In this case. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
exactly. You're welcome. Any other questions?
Becky, Jeff Bertram, on the variances and the applications that were brought forward that you referenced on page 6 of what we've received, what were the, and maybe you don't or can't do it today, but I'd like to know, and I'm sure others would, what were the reasons for the denials of the variance request? What, you know, because it helps us to kind of, the further forward we want to go, it helps to look backward to see what kind of specific requests we were getting and why we were getting them. For example, recently the financial situation, you know, getting a mortgage or something, that became a reality. So if we kind of know that, how can we best meet that issue if we want to moving forward? So that would be an example. So the denials, it would be helpful to know what were the basis of the denials of not receiving the application.
I did include in your packet a chart of all of the variances in these 2 7-year time periods. So I know the packet page numbering ends at 13, but if you go 2 pages beyond that to essentially 15 and 16 and 17, it's a 11 by 17 paper size. But each of the variances are itemized there. So if you look at, let's see here, we've got 2 denials, and those 2 were homes that were requesting it from the feedlot. Let's see here if I can recall. One of them did come back and change it and did get approval. I can tell you that on the one. And I don't know for sure on the second one if it maybe was that there were other alternatives, I want to say, but I can't say for sure. You know how with the variance you have to have reasonable practical difficulties, sorry. So, and then the prior time period, there were 4 of them, and that's going back so far here. I just don't have any recollection or details handy on those at this time. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful. And I guess, Jeff, too, just to respond to the situation for those splits, the proposed ordinance change with the exception would alleviate or you know, as long as, again, there's at least one person or entity that is full or partial owner of each parcel, those variances would no longer be necessary. So I will, if there aren't any more questions or discussion, I'm going to keep moving, and then we'll look at the end. Oh, sure.
Jeff Mergen. I was wondering, is it possible to have 2 different setbacks? In other words, could the setback, if a feedlot wants to be established near a residence, that set near a current residence, that setback be larger than if a current residence would choose to, or a current or a new residence would choose to be next to an existing feedlot? That would be, could be less than a new feedlot coming up to a residence. Could there be 2 different numbers?
So the statute hasn't changed, and my understanding has always been it's, you know, fully reciprocal. However, in this recent survey that I did, Douglas County is interpreting it to mean that it is specifically for a new. So what they have done is that they actually, let's see, I'll find it in your packet. It's going to be towards the end, but they actually are treating them differently. Let's see, Douglas County is on packet page 10. And they have no setbacks for existing. They have only a setback when it is a new feedlot or a new residence going in. And that's how they're treating the reciprocity. I have not run that by the county attorney's office to determine the interpretation of that statute and how Douglas County is administering it.
So if it's an existing feedlot and a new house, then they don't apply the setback? How do they, I'm trying to make sure I understand how they're applying that or not applying it.
So if there are 2 existing structures, I'm getting feedback, Shelley. I think maybe if you mute. Thank you. So if there's 2 existing structures, so if there's an existing feedlot and an existing residence, and one of them wants to add on, my understanding is that they don't have a setback.
So it's expansion.
Correct. And again, that would be a statute in the agricultural zoned districts. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Mergen?
I'm not sure.
And Jeff, excuse me, Becky, Commissioner Persky here too, and I'm not sure either, because if we say that these feedlots are a potential nuisance or a health threat potentially, there's a difference between me choosing as a resident coming and thinking I'm going to be okay moving closer to it than to someone bringing that onto me and moving that closer to me if I'm already existing. But so what we have is the ordinance is going to be the same either way, whether I'm bringing the feedlot closer to a neighbor or the neighbor's building closer to my feedlot. Is that correct?
That is correct, and how we have been always interpreted it in the past and applied it. Correct.
And Commissioner
Does it have to be
Mergen,
that way?
yes, the state statute requires us to have setbacks that are the same for a feedlot as a new residential dwelling. So we're not allowed to discriminate between a feedlot or a new house coming in. We have to treat them the same.
That answers my question.
Okay.
But we can treat them differently if it's the feedlot was there before the residents come. Then we can treat it differently.
If it's existing, I think correct. I'm not quite sure on the legal interpretation. So like if it's I'm not quite sure of a scenario in that. Can you maybe think of one, Jeff? You said an existing feedlot and a new house?
Right.
The new house would have to meet.
Right. The new house would have to meet the setbacks.
Yep.
Right. We've had several instances where a feedlot was there for 100 years and then a residence was allowed to be built. And then of course the resident then complains about the feedlot. Well, the feedlot, and then back in my first turn on the Planning Commission, we pushed and got, that's where it's in the abstract that the feedlot, the sight, sounds, and smells of farming pre-exist at the plat. Because again, we really want to recognize here what was first, what came first, the agricultural practice or a home. And then the other issue that we need to continue to remind ourselves with in all the training I've been through the county is they always say, don't look at the applicant that's in front of you, look at the next owner. And that's why my comments earlier were, it's great to allow some variance today, but suddenly you get somebody else that buys that house 20 years later and suddenly they start complaining, not fully understanding or realizing that the sights, sounds, and smells of agriculture were there for a long time, and then they cause issues. So we have to be sensitive to both. We shouldn't allow a feedlot come in my opinion, and crimp a residential situation, and we shouldn't allow a residential situation come into a feedlot situation and crimp the expansion of a feedlot. So it's a real fine balancing act, I think.
One of the things I do like about how Morrison County, you just had it up on the screen, has based on the animal units, they've put some different distances in, and it's something that we may want to consider. It seems like the majority of issues with feedlots, kind of pop up as those feedlots get bigger. At least I personally haven't seen too many issues in my experience yet, which is limited compared to some of you with more years of this. But with the smaller feedlots, there generally don't seem to be as many issues with the residential conflict that I've observed. But the large ones obviously can create more issues. So it might be a way of trying to provide more flexibility for people, yet trying to avoid the situations that Jeff's alluding to with the sights and smells and sounds of agriculture.
Yeah, and with respect to the tiered setback, the discussion on that also in the prior meetings has been that when a tiered setback is in place, in essence, it also can inhibit the expansion process for feedlots when they're zoned agricultural. So So that's why the recommendation, I think, stuck with more of the flat or the straight setback. However, as I pointed out earlier too, in our current ordinance, once a feedlot hits that 700 animal units, they are required to have the conditional use permit. And that process can actually put, odor reduction measures in place, or I think in theory even it could increase the setback. I don't know that that's ever been done in Stearns County before, but that would also be a mechanism that could happen through the CUP process. Now, years ago, we used to have a lower threshold for CUPs. And so I know there were some emails that were sent earlier today. And just to note, the feedlots involved in that situation up in the northeastern part of the county were feedlots less than 700 animal units. In fact, they were less than 500 animal units, and so the state doesn't even require a notice. So there are still some odor concerns that come up with the smaller feedlots that aren't triggering a CUP or noticing. If there aren't any other questions or comments.
Becky, Mike Pearl here. I just have one comment. When I read the paper, and I was a little surprised going forward and updating. I would have thought that we would have our setbacks would have been more and not less restrictive. I was kind of surprised by that. I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, and I think many of you participated in the steering committee for the comprehensive plan update, and that's where the comp plan, as I went over earlier, really gave the direction of looking at the setback and looking at a reduction. So maybe some of you can comment further on the thoughts on that.
Can townships be more restrictive than what we're putting in place?
I'm sorry, Joe, can you repeat that, please?
Could townships be more restrictive? The reason I'm asking this question is, we got expansion in Leasock Township, St. Wendell Township, maybe St. Joe Township. The areas of, encroachment into agriculture, around St. Cloud. This is less of an issue, the further west we get. So could the township be more restrictive?
Yes, the townships can be more restrictive. And some of them are. And actually, even one of our far western townships is more restrictive.
Yeah. And I just remember from the northeast portion of the county was some of this and around having flexibility. The hard part about if you're real restrictive with the with the setback, you will minimize some issues, but you'll create issues in other ways and really hampering people's ability to be flexible. We talk a lot about how agriculture will change in certain parts of the county, and you really can limit potential hobby farms and things like that can kind of spawn a different type of agriculture depending on what the setbacks are. I think it's appropriate for the county to be less restrictive and allow the townships to be more restrictive if there's issues in those areas. The more you can drive those types of decisions down to the local level of government, I think the better, the more influence that residents have where they live.
And Jason, I would agree with you. And then that's where I think size makes a difference, is that a lot of folks would not be opposed to a hobby farm next door to them at all. But they would maybe as far as a major dairy or hog production.
Yeah, exactly, Joe.
So I'm going to keep moving then, unless there are some more comments. Jason did bring up, the hobby farms, and that's really related to this last item of animal unit density in the ag districts. And this is, again, when a parcel is less than 10 acres. So the current ordinance you can see in the chart below would be capping the animal unit density at 4, or does cap it at 4. Again, it's based on parcel size, and the proposed amendment would increase that to a 6 animal unit density on those larger acreages, but yet under 10. And again, the thought here was to change to allow more livestock agricultural use potential in the ag district. And even though the variances in the past 14 years hasn't shown a great need for it, like with the residential dwelling setback variances, there is, it is a common question that we get. The variance, the one that we did have in the last 7 years was granted, and it was granted without a limit. So, and you saw the chart on this, but I guess just looking at that last column here, you can see that, oops, oh, where did I go? Sorry about that. Some of the counties are more restrictive in their animal unit density than Stearns County is currently, and a couple of them are less restrictive. So it's kind of a split almost there. The example, I have a couple of examples here for you. So this first one, example number 3, is on an acreage that is less than 10 acres, just under that 10 acres. So in fact, this was a parcel, oh, this is, okay, sorry. This one is zoned A40 again. And this was the one that was granted more. So actually it was found to be non-compliant because it actually had 11 animal units and the ordinance caps it at 4. And so they came in and applied for 256, which was goats, a lot of goats, 1,700 goats, alpacas, and some mini horses, and they were granted that variance. And then the second example that I have for you, this example number 4, is on 5.1 acres in A40. And this situation is where the feedlot was never registered because it never existed during that registration period from 1998 to 2001. And so the ordinance currently limits this parcel to 2 animal units. And this parcel was created in 2010. So it's not a lot of record. And so an individual that wants more than 2 animal units on this parcel would have to apply for the animal unit density. And this is an example Commissioner Notch brought to my attention just because it creates, because of the question of that he had regarding, we do have some small parcels out there that have been split off or maybe were lots of record with old or prior used livestock structures on it. And there's no way for us to get a count of how many exist out there. But there are some that exist out there. Would be, you know, easy for people to start small for a feedlot or even just have a small hobby farm. And so these are ones that we do often get calls on. We have no way of tracking how many don't apply for a variance. But this is a good example for some discussion if you want to talk further about this. And that's all that I have, except again to look for your guidance and recommendation on how to go forward with the language and what you want to see us take to that public hearing process on these 3 recommendations. So I think to summarize on item number 1, the recommendation, I think I'm hearing to stay at the 5. I've kind of heard a little bit different things, but I guess the last I kind of heard was some comments that staying at the 500 and letting townships be more restrictive. And then 2, I really didn't hear anything, I guess, concerning or different than what's being proposed on that. And 3, I guess we really haven't heard any discussion or comments on that. So please speak up to any of those items for us to take that forward.
Becky, it's Steve here. The townships being able to be more restrictive probably only takes effect if the counties have, or the townships have their own planning and zoning, correct? Otherwise they'd have to just create one separate of everything else if they don't have planning and zoning.
Correct. And I don't know, Shelley, if you know offhand, I feel like there's like 20 some townships that we have a memorandum of understanding with. but I might be off on that. I guess I don't have a quick way of pulling up how many already have some sort of ordinance to that they may want to amend, or even, I guess you're right, they may have to enact a memorandum with us if they want to be more restrictive than us.
And I think that's what we would look for, Commissioner Notch, is that the township would take a lead on wanting to become have a more restrictive standard, and then we would discuss with them what that standard would be, how do they want to apply it, and then determine, kind of their best options are. More than likely, they should adopt their own ordinance and then address it that way so that they have that standard in place. Wakefield Township, I believe, had a more restrictive standard, and I know they talked about removing that standard, and I don't know if they have done that or not. Yeah, okay, then it's been removed. But again, for a long time, they had a different standard because they had planning and zoning. And what we found is that it was very awkward and cumbersome for both the township and the property owners wanting to do something. So there was a lot of confusion and a lot of back and forth from the township perspective. But yes, they do have the right to be more restrictive.
Because I would think the pressures coming would be on the eastern townships, probably more so than the western. As St. Cloud kind of keeps slowly filtering out.
I wish I had a map showing where those restrictions are. But like I said, I want to say even two townships on the west end of the county that are more restrictive, and by quite a bit.
Yeah, I think Raymond is one of them, if I remember right.
Yes. Yep. Commissioner Notch, and maybe the commissioners and planning commission members remember that during our comprehensive plan conversation related to growth and development, what we were seeing is the Holding Ford, St. Wendell, and I'm getting a nod from Jason. I think those were the areas of concern, kind of the Brockway northern tier of townships. Because of the expansion of the cities, is that a direction that you want to see us, continue as allowing these changes so that we have some flexibility? We have ag zoning, and as Commissioner Bertram mentioned, the sights, smells, and sounds of ag aren't going to go away because you build your house there. So while people want to have a house out in a rural area, we have to remember that they're making a choice in an agricultural zoning district. So what type of flexibility are we trying to build in, and who are we trying to build flexibility for? Is it both parties? Then it becomes even more complicated. So I don't know if any of you remember those conversations we had at the comprehensive plan stage, but I think there was a lot of conversation about St. Wendell and Holding and Brockway, if I remember correctly. Jason, I'm going to look to you because you seem like you remember.
Well, right. We had a lot of talk about that, and it's a challenge. The point of like a planning commission and the ordinances at this level is to try to prevent those land conflict issues in the future. The reality is in that eastern portion of the state, just due to things outside of any of our control. I mean, it's just populations are growing. There's demand for people that want to live out in those more rural settings. So we're going to have more and more pressures put on that part of the county. The more restrictive all of the setbacks are, in some ways it makes life easier because you can quickly point to an ordinance and say, well, the ordinance doesn't allow for it. But that also creates its own set of challenges for people that live here and are trying to do things, and they are okay with the smells of agriculture, and that's why they're moving there. So it's a tough one, but I think a lot of this around the flexibility and maybe reducing some of these setbacks was specifically to try to set up the county to be able to morph and adapt a little bit more in the coming 10 to 15 years. That's what I remember from the discussion, Shelley.
Becky, Jeff Bertram, I know that we kind of we're on the path of making all these different changes, recommending ordinance changes and everything. Out of all of them that we've done to date, I think this might be the second or first most complex. I don't know that it has or should be on a fast track. I think there's a lot of information to absorb and to really think through. And maybe in this case, it would be good to have the public hearing on a draft and then come back and further discuss of what we're really hearing, because we really don't know, at least I don't, exactly what the current lay of the land is as far as these ordinance goes. One of our pillars obviously is agriculture, and we should continue to encourage that. But Jason is right. We're also told our task is to avoid we want to intentionally create conflicts for residential, and we don't want to create conflicts for agricultural, especially expansions. I remember two instances vividly. One was in St. Stephen, rural St. Stephen. There was an application to build a home, and of course we did the site reviews, and during the meeting I said, do you feel comfortable being that close to a feedlot? And it was a young couple, and he said, what feedlot? I said, there's a feedlot on the south side of the property. He had no idea that there was a feedlot. Their setbacks were not an issue. He had not gone over the hill. He had not walked the perimeter of the plat and did not know that there was. And I said, my God, there's going to be a conflict before we even approve this. And then, of course, when we do approve plats like that, some farmers have expressed concern of saying, well, now am I restricted? If I do want to expand and you allow that home to be built, and I decide 5 years from now that I want to expand, will I be able to? And the answer was no. And we didn't approve the plat because of that. So there's a lot involved in this. And I think if we could take, everything that we've gotten is a 10,000 foot view, bring it down to a 5,000 foot view, and then have the board have a preliminary draft public hearing. I think that would serve the county and the commissioners and us well, because we would have more feedback and more information. As you said, we got 3 emails today. There might be a lot of great thoughts out there of how to address these that we don't even know about yet. So that's my 2 cents. I would slow this down and kind of do it backwards of having the public hearing on a draft and then coming back, discussing it, and then firming it up.
I totally agree with
Becky, and I want to continue on as far as our role as reducing conflict. I want to go back to the question I asked, similar to lot size. Under this condition, would this apply then also, let's say, to just chicken barns? So could, the old Pilgrim's Pride or Golden Plump, whatever you want to call them, could they come within 500 feet then of a neighborhood if they're in the county, in the township, opposed to being in the city, and put up a barn on the west side of a community? Would this allow them to do that?
So yes, the setback doesn't apply differently to different types of owners. However, there is a setback also to municipalities, which is 1,000 feet. Or I'm sorry, I have to double check it. I think it ends up triggering a CUP. I forget what this actual setback is, but, and then there's the setback to unbuilt lots, or the buildable area of that lot, okay, which is right now is 700 feet. So what's being proposed is that would then become 500. But yes, okay. Or to answer your question though, in general, it doesn't, the ordinance doesn't get applied differently based on the type of owner. So corporation, if a corporation owns the livestock or the barn, it doesn't matter. The setback is the same.
So, yeah, so it doesn't matter if it's, again, a hobby farm or if it's, 5,000 chickens. It doesn't matter.
Correct. At this time, we do not
Okay.
have a tiered setback.
Okay.
Becky, this is Ken Mossman. I am hearing people want to start having more public hearings again. We've been working on this for 2 years now. We tried to notify people, I thought, over this period. How many meetings has there been where people have been out telling people to contact somebody, get a hold of somebody, come to meetings, do whatever. Now all at once, we're almost through it. Now they come along. I didn't know anything about it. I don't like the way it's done. And so we should start all over with public hearings again. It's to the stage where it's to the ending stage, not the beginning, is my understanding, right?
Commissioner Mossman, I think what we want to do is make sure that we provide the public every opportunity to speak to their concerns. I really appreciated the fact that we had some people go to Shape Stearns, take a look at it, and voice their concern about the setbacks. You as a planning commission member know how challenging it is to get people to come to meetings and participate. So what we want to do is encourage people to provide their input. Oftentimes what we will do is we'll hold the public hearing, take as much input as possible, then come up with alternatives at that public hearing, and then have that conversation. What do we want to do? And if then the board will decide which one they want to go with, option A, B, or C, based on what they're doing. So that's what we can do. We can certainly take a public hearing, testimony, and just not take action until there are dates that we have time to digest it and review it and have a different process if necessary. But we do want to, when you hold a public hearing, have a standard to start with so that people have something to react to. You don't want to just guess at what you're going to be amending. You have to have a specific standard that we're altering. So that's what we'd be looking to do, something along that line potentially.
This is Jeff Bergen. I think an important part here is knowing that one size does not fit all. And eastern Stearns County is much different than western Stearns County. And the important thing that came up is that we're just setting a guideline here, as I see it, as a county, and the townships can be more restrictive if they need to be. But if we set real strict guidelines, townships can't be less restrictive. And that's where I'm looking at this.
My thought is then the eastern townships should step up, and they want us to do the work or take the blame for different things. They should get some of their own restrictions if they don't want certain things. That's kind of what you're saying, right, Jeff? That those townships should step up and do a little work themselves.
Yes. And that's what Shelley had said, that townships can be more restrictive. And in some cases, maybe that would be appropriate.
Hi, this is Sean. I'd have to say that we're repeating ourselves here in the same discussion about Wendell Township and their inability to work with us on these things and the differences between the east and west side. I believe I fall with Ken on the fact that we're here now and we're getting to this point and we're supposed to be making these decisions, but yeah, a little more public input would not be a bad thing. I also am somewhat interested in the possibility of the tiered approach on these.
If there is interest in a tiered approach, I would really appreciate some suggestions on what that might look like.
Jeff Bertram, Jason brought it up earlier, and I think that's a good point. We don't see or hear a lot of issues with the smaller feedlots. It's the larger ones that we've heard issues from, number one. So I guess I'd be open to doing that. Two, I'm not sure who wants to start this process over. I certainly don't. But we came in this with a 50,000 foot view. Now we're down to a 10,000 foot view. If we're going to put in an ordinance, I guess if I'm the only one, that's fine. But I want to make darn sure that we're going to put something in ordinance that's going to be workable. So I haven't looked in detail when this since the comprehensive plan, and that wasn't near as detailed as this is. And no different than what you did with the RVs. We'd spent a lot of time with that. You heard a lot of input from the public, and you paused. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good. That's what the process is about. So I don't think we're starting over. And if we're going to get penalized, it's Lent, I guess, and we're going to have to forgive that we're listening to people, then so be it. We'll need to confess that at the right time then.
I'm really kind of game for anything. At the end of the day, it would be nice to get this one done and move on, but on the flip side, that's not really doing our responsibility any justice either, and making sure we're trying to avoid conflicts in the future. So if we have to slow down, I'm game for that. I'm still okay with the tiered thing. I know I mentioned it earlier. I would throw something out there, and honestly, this is now my area of expertise. Some of you have been doing this a lot longer with the feedlots, but I look at a 25 or 30 animal unit feedlot being completely different than one that's over 200. And I also think that based on the flexibility that was discussed during the comprehensive planning phase, that may help deal with a lot of the issues that are coming up in the eastern part of the state, or I guess we anticipate will continue in the eastern part of the state.
Becky, this is Sean. In looking at those numbers of all of the discussions and the petitions during those 7-year periods there, and one of them was much higher than the other, what was the difference? Was it because we made more rules? Why did we have so many more discussions and petitions?
I'm not certain because we don't necessarily, I believe, I know anecdotally, in part, some of it is financial related. The banking rules had changed, I think, in that time period, or with mortgages and lending. So some of those were related to splits, as I had mentioned earlier. But I also am seeing in our numbers, as I tally things at the end of every year with feedlots, is that our number of smaller hobby farms continues to increase, as do our larger feedlots, when the medium-sized feedlots continues to decline. And these are slow progression, slow, but that is the continued trend. So I think we maybe have seen more requests come in because of the lending differences or practices, requirements rather, as well as just the desire, more desire for larger farms and also the hobby farms.
Ken and Mike, you guys, I know, have a lot of experience in the feedlot stuff. Where do you see the difference in animal units when people go from hobby farming to this is a profession, in which case I really might look at expanding that feedlot over time? Do you have I threw a number out there, but what would your thoughts be if you were going to go to a tiered, that you could kind of separate that hobby farm from the commercial farming?
This is Ken Mossman. See, I thought a tiered thing when I first saw it would be a good idea, and then we were kind of told, no, you don't want to go that route. But you can get up to 100 or 200 animal units and not cause a big. It's when you get into the over 500, 600 animal units, and that's where the county steps in. When you get over, was it 600, then you need to get conditional use permits, and then you start needing manure management plans and things like that. So you have a lot of people controlling what you're doing with everything. So you just don't go out there and make a mess. You have to do things or you're going to be shut down.
And I can speak to that a little bit too, as far as people that tend to have a feedlot and work off the farm. It tends to be mostly beef operations, as well as, then you've got your hobby farms. But I would say, around the 100 animal unit. And then the different thresholds that currently exist would be at 50 animal units, registration is required by the state outside of shoreland. At 100 animal units, they have to start keeping records of the manure application and be compliant. At 300 animal units, they are required by the state to have a permit. And of course, the county requires it anyway, but at that time, we also do a state permit for their construction or expansion. At 500 animal units, it gets notified to neighbors and in the paper, or neighbors or the paper. At 700 is where our CUP threshold is currently.
So Becky, Steve here. So if a farmer or individual wants to put up 2, let's say, Pilgrim's barns or even 1, how many animal units are in one?
I know it's under 300 animal units.
Yeah, so I think some of those emails that were being shared before, that's an indication of, some of the angst there too. You throw up 2 of these barns, and if you're talking less animal units, nothing shows up.
Correct.
Becky, you mentioned one of the cutoffs being 100 animal units, though. In most cases, those chicken barns are going to be more than 100 animal units, correct? Correct.
If I remember, it's just under 300, I think, for one barn, but I'd have to look it up to be sure.
Okay.
And Becky, you mentioned that 100 units is when they have to have a manure plan?
Not a plan, actually. So there's a difference between having to keep manure application records and having to have a plan as to what they plan to do with the manure. So the one is forward thinking and the other is backward looking. So at 100 animal units, they have to keep track of what they do with it. So they have to document what happens with that manure. Once they reach 300, they have to have a plan for what they're going to do. And of course, they have to keep the records of what they do. And that's not to say, currently our ordinance does meet it mirrors the state requirements. So in the past, the county had an ordinance that was more restrictive. So we would require the manure management plan at 100 animal units, but that's no longer the case. We are mirroring the state on the manure planning.
Okay, so if we would make that, saying that we would want a different tier and say we wanted to be more restrictive to the larger feedlots, if we would go at 100 animal units, even with that, they could still come in, if the neighbors were in agreement, they could come in and get a variance on that. Would that be correct?
At this time, the ordinance and what's proposed would not allow for a neighbor to sign off. That it does require the Board of Adjustment to make the decision.
So then the Board of Adjustment could make that, could allow that to happen then?
Correct. Yes. I think you were kind of maybe speaking to 2 different things there. Like you're alluding to a neighbor signing off as well as the Board of Adjustment. But at this time, of course, the Board of Adjustment has to approve it.
Okay.
Well, Becky, Jason Crone again, to maybe keep the discussion moving here. I'm totally cool with some of the suggestions and getting more public feedback. I think that's good. I also would maybe then add to what we had listed as potential options is doing something from a scaled perspective. And to me, I would change that to 100 animal units based on that's when we start tracking records, which could also help deal with some of the issues that potentially could arise once you hit that point. It would seem like a logical number. And I'm just throwing it out there to keep things moving here, but that'd be my recommendation.
And the only other example, as you can see on the slide that I have up, is Morrison County, and they set that at 300 animal units. But yeah, I hear you on the 100, and that's what I've noted.
So this is Carol, and I think this is a really good really good conversation. I think we should be planning that we're going to a hearing and that we're going to get input at that hearing. It's not really a draft hearing because I'm not really sure what that means. I mean, I really think that Jeff, you and others talking about that, what you're talking about, we may find, not because of how many people want to talk, but we may find that there's another idea that comes up that might make us consider a change. But I think if we're not putting in something that we think we might think is our best foot forward, I'd be a little concerned about that. So I think what we're doing is great. That's, for what it's worth, that's where I'm at. What we did with the RVs, I think we didn't have quite the right solution yet. And we found that out. And hopefully we can come up with something here so that, Ken, I'm thinking about what you said, so we don't take another 7 years.
Okay, so I think what I will do is put together an additional option, which includes the tiered system and with the break at 100. And then we can propose that for the public hearing, along with the other two changes then that were proposed regarding the animal unit density, as well as the same or common owner exception. Does that summarize what you all have been saying? Okay.
Yeah, and Becky, Jason,
I'd go back to what Jeff Mergen said, is that these are guidelines. In essence, is what he said. I think I got it right.
Yeah. Yes.
And don't worry about getting it right, because you know it's a matter of perspective. When all is said and done, we can look back on this effort, if it ever gets over, and we can say, yes, it's better than it was. You got the job done. So it's not going to be perfect.
Touche. And I suppose if we learned something in the implementation that you all say, hey, we should relook at this, well, then we should relook at it.
Okay. Was there someone else that was about to say something?
Becky, as Jason Crone, I was just going to clarify, but Wallstate, you mentioned when you were going to layer the tiered option in there for feedback, that was based on like 100 animal units being less restrictive. And then what? I just didn't want to leave it. I didn't know if you had clarity on the other side of that, or if you needed more direction.
Well,
what were you thinking as far as
my assumption, that's good. Thank you for bringing that up. My assumption was going with the 500 at less than 100 animal units, and then keeping it at 700 feet for anything 100 animal units or above. And so if that's not summarizing correctly what any of you were thinking, then please speak up.
That's what I was thinking, Becky. I just wanted to make sure because it wasn't explicitly stated. So
correct. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
This is Sean. I have to say I appreciate that too. I like that.
Okay. Well, that is all I have for feedlots. So I don't know if you guys did want to take a break before Mark begins his presentation on the septics, holding tanks. But I will be leaving you, so enjoy the rest of your meeting. Thank you for your input and your time in reviewing.
Thank you, Becky.
Thanks, Becky.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Becky. I'm all for taking 5.
I'm fine with that too. Just letting everyone know now, I have a hard stop at about 5:15, so I'm probably going to miss the end of this next discussion. But
okay, very good. Well, let's take
for kids.
Yeah, let's take 5 minutes as a quick break. I'll get the presentation set up, ready to roll, and we'll come back at 4:50 or 4:55, something like that. So.
whatever that was, I'm not aware. All I caught was just so you're aware.
Say, folks, I am going to be on to another meeting at 5:30 as well, so I'll be checking out early and waiting.
Well, hopefully we'll be done at by 5:30.
We can.
5:15 might be pushing it, Jason Crown. I don't know if we can do it that fast.
I can talk pretty quick. I don't know. So.
I know.
Okay, we're live.
The more of this I can get in, the better. This will be good stuff. I'm curious to learn more about this topic.
All right. Well, maybe let's start up and get going then. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. For those that don't know me, my name is Mark Latteral. I'm the supervisor for the Environmental Health Division for the Environmental Services Department, which includes sewage treatment programs. So let's talk about holding tanks. Becky briefly showed this earlier. Hopefully this, like I said, hopefully this will be a more simple subject than the feedlot concerns have presented the group so far today. But the goal today would be to kind of review the regulations and provide recommendation to the county board for the utilization of holding tanks for other establishments in the county. Looking at kind of a brief outline, we'll kind of just go over quickly how this affects the implementation for the comp plan, and then we'll move into the actual sewage treatment or the holding tank discussions. I know Angie had shared this slide in the last meeting, but I think I modified it a little bit just to kind of show how sewage treatment or this topic will fit in. You kind of go from the large vision down to the goals and the existing conditions into the 5 pillars. We look at the policy areas, and I've selected the economic development and the natural resource protection policy areas that would kind of play into the sewage treatment updates. So going from that large view down to what may need amendments in our ordinances here. So looking at the 5 pillars identified in the comp plan, this SSTS concern can be identified into 2 of the pillars. Chose the business pillar and the nature pillar. In the business pillar, the SSTS fits into the mix as we look to support the existing businesses and help them keep operating costs lower, as well as helping the upstart businesses keep initial startup costs minimal with potentially easier SSTS solutions for their operations. Looking at the comprehensive plan goals and objectives, potential changes to the regs would support the outlined goals and objectives by having rural businesses in the ag areas utilize the properties, existing infrastructure and buildings that also satisfy the easier permitting needs for all small scale farms, hobby farms, and home businesses. So there's any thoughts on that portion, pillar? None? This issue also can address the nature pillar. It fits into the mix as we look in a much broader sense of the protection of the water resources of the county. Again, this comp plan goals and objectives for the nature pillar steer us in emphasis of protecting the natural resources of the county, specifically both surface and groundwater resources, ultimately leading to conservation and protection of drinking water. Thoughts or concerns with that at all from anyone? Seeing none? Okay. So going back to the outline then, we'll move into that main focus point of holding tanks and the usage by other establishments. So through the comp plan public engagement process, the issue that was brought up was the limited allowances of holding tanks use allowed for other establishments. So before we get too far into this, I think it'd be appropriate to identify what another establishment is. For Minnesota Rural and Other Establishment, or OE, as you'll see it reflected in some of the slides, is any public or private structure other than a dwelling that generates sewage that discharges to a subsurface sewage treatment system. This discussion would primarily focus, other establishments would be referring to the smaller rural businesses. So how this would play into working with the small cabinet shops, butcher shops, storage units, trucking companies, small ag businesses. So, looking at as I was saying, the issues that were identified, the parameters for other establishments being allowed to use a holding tank are too restrictive, is the concern that we heard. This has led to an increase of the Board of Adjustment variance applications for the use of holding tanks for other establishments. And the growing need was identified for the allowance of the holding tanks in non-dwelling situations.
Mark, do you want to explain what the does this mean for halls and things like that, outbuildings?
I'm sorry, say that again. You were breaking up.
Does this mean like township halls and accessory dwelling units and things like that?
Well, and township halls would definitely be considered another establishment. It's not a dwelling. Accessory dwelling units, I think we would look to those as those would be more along the lines of having a complete system for, because they are housing rather than another establishment. Really, other establishments are business or anything that isn't a housing situation primarily. So, does that answer the question?
So Mark, what would be an example then of something under number 3? Those other ones fit under really number 2.
I guess 2 and 3 are maybe 2 and 3 are really saying the same thing.
Okay.
What has been identified is that there's a need for the current ordinance language may be too restrictive, and that small businesses out in the rural area or that are other establishments, maybe like I said, the small cabinet shops, the butcher shops, any of those smaller businesses, rather than saying that you can't have a holding tank to serve that business, because they may only have 2 or 3 employees, right? They're not going to generate that large of a flow. Maybe a holding tank is a better solution for them. Currently, all those folks that want to do that for their businesses are sent to the Board of Adjustment to obtain relief in the form of a variance to be able to install a holding tank rather than putting in a complete system.
So as we wanted to increase our flexibility out in the rural area, that's why we wanted to look at other establishments and holding tanks. In some cases, it may be necessary for a holding tank. In others, they may have enough sewage or disposal where a full system would be warranted.
This is Commissioner Blankish. Say, Mark, would this be applied to, let's say, a homeowner that is in a rural setting, has that nice big steel storage shed in the back, and has a wash bay in there, and they wash their four-wheelers and maybe a pickup truck or two, and they have a floor drain? Is this one of those applications? Would it be there, or is there some other system to handle that runoff?
Right. So in that type of a situation, actually, a holding tank is the right answer. This, as we're speaking to today, wouldn't apply to that. That would actually fall under the non-domestic waste situation for floor drains. And since you're specifically washing vehicles, you'd want to capture that because you may have antifreeze or oils or whatever else. So, and we can permit holding tanks via the ordinance now for that non-domestic waste situations. Actually, you could, if an individual wanted to daylight that, they could actually do that too, as long as it met the parameters of the private, I forget what that's, it's the, there's a provision.
Class 5 injection one?
No, it's here. I found it. It's the floor drains in private garages are classified as Group U Division 1 occupancies serving 1 or 2 family dwellings may discharge to daylight. So basically, me as a private property owner and I have a shed in back, if I wanted to have a floor drain in there, I could daylight that instead of putting it to a holding tank. Our recommendation, though, is you put it to a holding tank, as we don't want those chemicals being dispersed out. So, so in that situation, we would handle that under a non-domestic waste holding tank permit, which is allowed in Section 2.3 of our current ordinance, sewage treatment ordinance. So these are dealing more with true sewage wastes in kind of that rural business, small business settings. So does that answer your question, Richard?
Yes, Mark, thank you.
Okay, all right. Moving on here then. So looking at our current rules, what does our current language allow? Section 6.5 of Ordinance 422 currently outlines the usage of holding tanks. It states when and what situations that a holding tank is allowed in typical permitting parameters. So as you can see, number 1 listed there, Section 6.5 starts out saying straight out that holding tanks for new residential dwellings, groups of dwellings, or other establishments shall not be allowed. It just flat out says they're not allowed. And then the next section down in 6.51, we make a list of exemptions. And we can take a look at what those exemptions kind of look like. So this is a clip of the ordinance language, the current ordinance language that makes allowances for 8 situations. It grants standard permitting to occur with proper design, submittal, review, and approval. So as you look through this list A to H, you'll see holding tanks are allowed right out of the gate for, and this includes not only just other establishments, which is our main focus here today, but it also talks about residential lots as well, or homes. You know, for a failing system, you can convert to a holding tank to avoid an imminent health threat. There's allowances for existing lots that were existing prior to 98, where site limitations aren't limit the ability to put a type 1 or a type 2 system in there. There's provisions to for privately owned recreational campers not located in a recreational vehicle park. So my camper out on a lake lot. For vault toilets in public parks, for residential accessory structures, egg accessory structures, and animal feedlot buildings with laboratory facilities. For replacement dwellings constructed under the state statute 394.36, which is the nonconformity statute. Also, holding tanks are permitted straight out for vehicle dump stations in recreational vehicle, or in RV parks, excuse me. And then also for privately owned privies. So currently, those 8 are the 8 that a holding tank is allowed to be permitted out. Other than that, applicants would be sent to the Board of Adjustment to gain allowance to put a holding tank in for their situation. So, any thoughts on that? That's just current language. So, moving on. So now that we know what the current language ordinance prescribes, you know, I guess I would kind of ask for people's thoughts on it. What do you think about it? Is it too restrictive? Did it need change? I guess the point is to hear feedback and the concerns from this group.
Mark, Jason Crone, a question for you, and before I have to run here. What are the logical reasons why not a holding tank? And obviously there becomes a volume a volume consideration when a holding tank just doesn't make sense to do. But short of a holding tank potentially leaking, so that's why a treatment facility is preferred, why not a holding tank for businesses or other entities? Help me understand that.
Right, good question. Well, for as long as I've been with the department, the philosophy has been for sewage treatment that if you're able to install a sewage treatment system for your home or for a business, that a system should be installed in order to treat and return that water, to recycle that water back into the groundwater, right? Holding tanks, while they'll seem to be a good option at first, or maybe that's the easy, it's an easy option. And I think this kind of goes with my notes with another slide, but I kind of address it here. Holding tanks, even though they may seem the easy or the cheaper way out, in the long term, holding tanks may not always be the best option. Cost-wise, it'll be, especially for residences, or tanks will fill up quicker than people will realize. With businesses, however, I do somewhat agree that holding tanks may make a better decision for businesses for the fact that you don't necessarily may have that flow. You may be deciding we're dealing with high strength waste here, because you're not getting the wash water to dilute everything out, whatever. And then there's also, we live in Minnesota, so there's the freezing concern, right? The downside is the maintenance and keeping on the maintenance. With the holding tanks that we permit now, one of the provisions in the ordinances will get annual pumping records by January 31st of each year. Now, we do get some, but I will say we don't get them all. So it's holding tanks can present an issue with tracking down the maintenance. Are they being done? Do we get calls on people that don't want to pay the fee for the pumper, so they throw their own pump in and out into the field next door? Farmers are spreading the manure on the field. What's the difference here? Kind of thing. So there's concerns that way, that it may look like the easier, the quick way out or the cheaper way out. But there's that maintenance, that long-term concern on cost as well. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Mark, if I can just add maybe a little, but in the realm of things, though, it's no different than putting in a mound system or new tanks. Like now, mine were just put in maybe 10 years ago, but now the new regulation is you got to have the clean up to the surface. So now if I do anything, so now I have to, revamp what I already have, even though it's functioning. So irregardless, I guess I don't put a lot of weight on that, just for the mere fact that, things are changing anyway. So mine's going to probably cost more than, a person has to pump a tank in once a year.
Yeah. Maybe I should slide. Let me, I'm going to slide forward. I'm going to find my notes. And these are just as speaking to costs, right? So I think the last time I pumped my tank, I paid around $180 to have my sewer tank pumped out at my house. I would guess cost range maybe is from $150 to $225 to have a tank pumped when you pump it, depending on the volume you're taking out. So I know this slide gets into this really was going to fall into, as you can see on the slide, the volume calculations. Using a volume calculations from the state books, if you looked at the flow values, say someone wanted to put in a 1,000-gallon holding tank, we'd say, well, it's 1,000 gallons, right? Using the flow data for a business, 1,000-gallon holding tank would last about 10 days before the alarm would be setting off, because the alarm that's required to go off at 75% capacity, so you're at about 750 gallons. maybe 13 to 14 days before a full 1,000-gallon tank would get filled if we were losing this data that's on the screen, a 4-person business at 17 and a half gallon per day per person. Reality is that's book values. They're probably not using that. So cut it in half. Maybe you're using half that much on a 4-person business per day, so maybe 30 gallons per day. Really, you might be pumping that tank once a month, small business. And if you're pumping that tank once a month let's just take an average of $175 a pump, your yearly cost on pumping that tank is around $2,100. Now you take that $2,100 over the next 3 years, make that $6,300. Well, for the $6,300 that I just put into a truck hauling waste away, I could have probably put a small drain field in, and for the next 15 or 20 years, had my solution resolved. So economically, holding tanks don't always play into the best solution.
Jeff Mergen, what about recreational areas that operate on a seasonal basis, such as softball parks, baseball parks, those types of things? Would a holding tank make more sense there rather than having a drain field that sits empty all winter? And I don't know what is the wear and tear on that when it's not in use.
Right. So when you get to a stadium like that, you're going to be, or use like that, it may make more sense for a holding tank to go there too, because you may not have the flow. I mean, if you're not having the wash water or bath water, whatever, you're getting toilet waste flows, which could lead to that higher strength waste. So I can see where a holding tank might make sense there. But then again, I would say the organization that is operating that baseball park or softball park or whatever, what is their budget? Are they willing to pay that $2,100 a year? Well, it wouldn't be a year because they're seasonal, like you said. So cut it in half. I don't know. I guess those are good questions to ask, Commissioner Morgan. Shelley, thoughts? No?
Well, what I was going to ask on that, and I think it is a good question, it depends on, are you putting your concession stand to that holding tank as well? Are you running water out of that concession stand? Are you, what are you all doing? And I think that's a really good question, because I know we have a lot of small ballparks around the county, and I think they may fit under our low volume user concept. And in some cases, it may make sense for that. In other cases, when they have other uses, for example, out at where they play softball in Brockway, what's the name of that?
At Upper Deck.
Upper Deck. They got a lot of activity there, and they have a larger menu. They have things happening. So they're a business where you wouldn't want a single holding tank there. But, like Richmond, you're a smaller concession, a smaller area. It might be perfectly logical to have a holding tank. So I think that gets back to the when and where is it appropriate, and are we looking at all the circumstances surrounding that use? And I think those are the exact kind of questions we wanted to have today.
My question also revolves around, is there additional wear and tear on a drain field that totally sits unused for 6 months or more?
I would say no. I mean, if it's
that should not hurt it just to not be in use?
No, it'll dry out, and then, because there's a lot of situations where a drain field may have become ponded and isn't taking water. And once you divert water away from it, it'll dry out. That biomat layer that's created at the bottom of the soil rock interface, may dry down, dry apart. It may start taking water again, so you may prolong the life. I know there's a number of properties out there that have dual systems, and they'll have a valve and switch from one to the other just to rest one, to let it dry out, switch back and forth. So I don't think that.
So that part shouldn't be an issue.
I don't.
sitting unused.
That would be my opinion, at least. So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions? So going back to my slide, I kind of jumped ahead there. I'm sorry, but so kind of looking at options for other establishments. Where and when would holding tanks be appropriate for use, and number two, at what oversight level is there additional needed oversight for holding tanks for other establishments? And then number three would be, I guess it's a suggestion on my part, maybe a creation of a new permitted user category. We get to a low volume generator type situation that would make permitting holding tanks for these types of businesses easier without the need for variances. We would look to that to try to gain more flexibility. So,
Mark, what the number of variances that were requested, what were they? We permitted quite a few lockers. I assume it was them. You kind of referenced it earlier. Were there any other type of references or applications to the Board of Adjustment because of the void?
Yeah. I didn't do quite the statistical analysis that Becky provided you with the feedlot information, but I did look back, and if you see in page 19 of the agenda packet in the first relevant section, item number 7, I did look up in 2020 we did have 14 permits issued for holding tanks that serve other establishments. So with 14 permits being issued, that would have meant they were all at the Board of Adjustment to get a variance. And whether it was, I know a few of them, the meetings that I attended personally, there was, I recall, one for a mini storage locker. There was one for meat locker, cabinet shops, those kind of things. So it's those small businesses with 3 to 4 employees that just aren't going to generate that waste. So they pursue the variance for the holding tank for their business. So.
And then the amendments that were made, Mark, since 2010, there was 3 amendments. What were those amendments?
Well, each amendment had a various parts to it. I mean, I didn't have the specific strikeout add in for each one. I can tell you in the 21, I guess that would pertain to this holding tank specific. The amendment in 2011, one of the changes that was brought forth in that was a reduction in oversight. So in 2008, when the state rules were modified, the Minnesota rules were modified. Actually, they went through a large revamp, which led to Ordinance 22 being developed and adopted by the county board. The original rule adoption required operating permits for every holding tank, whether it was a business or a residence. After much feedback to the state dropped that out of the state rule, and we turned, I know, part of that 2011 amendments requirement for operating permits for holding tanks locally. I mean, that's the one. But there were other portions of the sewage ordinance that were amended through those amendments. They just weren't all holding tank issues. So, any other questions? So, looking at the slide here, so options. Looking at the when and where, obviously option 1 would be not to do anything as it is. Continue to require other establishments to install a system to manage their waste. But if that was our option, I'm not sure we'd be having this discussion today. So option 2, maybe allow the usage of holding tanks as a permitted system for all other establishments regarding the ability to install a complete system. So if that's their desire to want to do it, change the overall philosophy of the department, of the county, from if you're able to put a system in, you should put a soil-based system in that can treat the wastewater and put it back into the ground. If they get a design done and want to permit a holding tank for any other establishment, we could move that direction. We could also look at allowing the use of holding tanks as a permitted system for other establishments regardless of design flow, or institute maybe a limit to that flow, kind of as I've alluded to a little bit here. So, you know, those are just thoughts or concepts. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts to add into that or not. Hearing.
I'm going to be running to my next meeting. My concern would be if we do open it up for more holding tanks, then we will be doing more policing, and we would have to do some type of enforcement with, you know, I don't know what type of penalties for those that are abusing it. So, I mean, that's going to be a reality if we do open it up to that end. So that would be my.
Yep, good point, Commissioner Bursky. It's one of those things, if you implement the rules, there would be a consequence to not following them, I guess. So moving on to, you know, what oversight is needed for establishments for holding tanks. Currently in the ordinance, regardless if you're another establishment or a residence, people who install a holding tank are required to have a valid contract with a certified maintainer to ensure that that tank gets pumped out and that contents disposed of in accordance to Minnesota rules. A copy of that pumping contract is required at the time we do the permitting for those holding tanks. And like I said, that's already part of our ordinance and part of state rule. Additionally, in the ordinance, it states that by January 31st of each year, the owner of a holding tank is supposed to submit the maintenance records for the previous year to the department, how many times they pumped it and who they pumped it with. As I stated also, we do have some of those float in, but I know we're not getting all the records submitted for all the holding tanks that we have out there in the county now. So if we allow more to go forward, I don't know if there would be a desire to put an active chase on those kind of submittals, or leave it more as it is now, where it's a requirement and voluntary submittal type situation.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Sure.
I'm going to go back to do we think it's necessary to make a change? I'm going to ask Sean Blackburn to jump in. He was on Board of Adjustment in 2020, and that was a concern from the Board of Adjustment. So, Sean, you want to speak a little bit maybe to kind of what you saw and why you thought those should be granted, and any thoughts from there?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, actually, I was going to speak up. We had a number of those, right? And I have to say, me personally, I think we should leave it the way it is without a change. I like the fact that you have to have a field. If you can't, you need to ask for a variation. And we did deal with a lot of them, and it was we asked very particular questions and very specific about sizes and volume and these kinds of things. And it was only, as he stated, 14 or so one or two per meeting. It wasn't, it didn't take up a lot of time, but it was important conversations, and I appreciated it, and I think it was handled well by everyone involved, and fairly, I would have to say, approved of.
Thank you for those comments, Sean.
So I'm curious whether it's Sean or Mark or Shelley, of the ones that come in front of the Board of Adjustment, is there commonalities in there that we could address without wide scale changing things? Is there something discrete enough or not really?
And Terrell, the commonality actually that would come to me, and Joe could probably even speak to this if he's still with us, was
I thought he left, or I would have.
A number of them were guys who just had little butcher shops that they were setting up in the back, where they were handling game and meats from local hunters and stuff like that. And it was just a little operation. So you're talking about different kinds of wastes. and how you handled that waste. But when you throw into the whole picture the human waste thing, and you have 1 or 2 employees or 3 maybe, and maybe just a small customer base that's around on occasion with a, it's a small volume, and it's probably far separated from any kind of municipal service that might be possible, or it can't be reached for some reason because of where it's situated. It was, they were all pretty straightforward.
Thank you.
Makes a good point. The more complicated you make this, the less compliance you'll get.
Thank you, Commissioner Lensmeyer. Anyone else? Thoughts?
So we're on the oversight page. Can you go back to the page where you were asking the questions?
Here?
Oh, no, I thought you had potential options. Okay.
Yep. So I think maybe go ahead, Commissioner Clark.
No, go ahead. You might be answering my question, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. Right. So we'll move on to the next slide. So just my last comment here, my last paragraph there. This is changes that were made in 2011 where we did pull the oversight that was mandated through the Minnesota rule requirement changes of 08, where we dropped that operating permit requirement to make it easier for people as far as oversight by the county for the holding tanks and permits that we were issuing. So, so moving on then. So one thought then would be to, if this group thought it would be a good idea, we could look towards moving towards something called a low volume generator. Kind of like I was explaining before with my notes or my dollar analysis there. We could possibly create some language into the ordinance that would widen the permitting window for holding tank usage for non-dwelling structures that have a limited design flow. So like Sean was saying, the smaller business setups with the 2-3 employees, and kind of the potential for doing that versus putting the drain field in is like I mentioned before, the potential of high strength waste, because you don't have that flow to dilute. The state rules require waste be at certain strength levels before they hit the dirt in a drain field to be treated. So if there isn't the wastewater to dilute that before it gets out there, you can be at too high of a strength waste situation. Also, if the flow isn't there, you have freezing issues with a system that gets minimal flow out to it in the winter versus a system that isn't used at all during the winter, like Commissioner Mergen brought up, maybe with a ballpark situation. So again, just looking at number 2, then, if you would entertain an option of a low volume generator situation, there have to be a threshold picked somewhere at what the max gallons per day would be on a design for something of that nature. Going by code book, it provides us an opportunity to pick various gallons per day for various situations. And looking at an industrial or just say a business situation, the code book requires 17.5 gallons per day per employee. And if you went to a 4-person business, that would get you to approximately 75 gallons per day flow, which I think when we look back at maybe most of the variance applications, they would have been that maybe that 4-person or less business. So that would have alleviated the request to the Board of Adjustment. Also, then you can see at a 4-person business, the sizing criteria for the tank is 5 times the design flow. So at 75 gallons, you're not going to have that large of a tank. A 1,000-gallon tank would be plenty big to accommodate that. So, any thoughts there? Hearing none. Okay. So I did kind of look around. What do our neighbors do? what do our neighbors allow? So kind of keeping in the same group of counties. Morrison County does allow holding tanks to go in for seasonal or intermittent nature type settings, not using more than 150 gallons per day. So maybe that 75 should get bumped up to 150 if we entertain that. They do increase the gallon requirement of their minimum tanking capacities also. Douglas County has a provision for, jumping around, sorry. Douglas County does have provisions left in their ordinance that if you're on a holding tank, you need to have a water meter so you can identify how much water is being used. They also left in their ordinance an operating permit requirement. They didn't eliminate that provision. So, and I know Douglas County is very active in seeking out that information. I think they take their whole group of holding tanks, and I don't know if it's split in half or split in thirds, but they do like reminder postcard mailings out to their residents saying, you know, turn your yearly records in for submittal. So they're much more proactive about getting those records than we are at Stearns here. Going on to compare to other counties, Wright County allows holding tanks. They run on they have a percentage of a value of an increase of a structure. You can get a holding tank. They allow them for corrective situations just like we do. They don't really have anything specific for other establishments identified in their requirements. Sherburne County, they also require the operating permits. They held on to that standard. They didn't drop that. Kandiyohi County takes a more laid-back approach. From what I understand, you contact the zoning administrator and have a conversation, and if it works out and they both agree, it's allowed. There isn't much beyond that there. And then looking to our neighbor to the east, they also require an operating permit for holding tanks. They also have the 1,500 gallon minimum tank capacity. But this is where I didn't reinvent the wheel. I saw that they have this low volume user set up already. And they allow it for other establishments with a maximum of 3 water using devices. Only a sink, a toilet, or an emergency shower, or a washing machine, I guess. So 3 out of those 4 options, and then you can get a holding tank for other establishment. It doesn't really go on a gallons per day use. It just goes on the number of water using devices. So, and then again, they lump in that township hall aspect there. So just kind of seeing what's in the neighborhood, who else allows what as far as our neighboring county goes. So,
Mark,
it strikes me that the amount of compliance and / regulation is directly related, from what I can tell, no further study, to the economic impact of the lake properties, to the local base. So you've got a bunch of lake residents, and you want to, protect that because it's important to the economy. Any sense?
Yeah, very much so. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Mark, I was just going to, this is Steve. I was just going to mention, kind of like Kandiyohi is where if you indicate, a pumping company, which might help, you might have an idea then, of all the tanks out there, who has somebody listed as, they can always change, but at least they have somebody listed. And I do like Benton County's, options as well.
Yeah.
I actually had the same 2 thoughts on both of those, Steve.
So did I.
the maintenance requirement, like I said, is a requirement for the permitting. So we'll always have a maintenance company identified when we permit it. Like you say, Commissioner Notch, a person's always free to change companies that they use. Where we don't get notified is that change typically. So our permit just holds the original document saying company A is pumping my system, where actually now they're using company C. So, you know, we won't know that for sure. But as long as they have someone doing that maintenance and is being done properly and according to the state's septic requirements, I guess that's the important part there. So.
Well, Mark, then if I can ask you, maybe this is kind of unrelated, but so all these septic pumping companies out there, I'm assuming they have to have records of who they pumped and what they do with it, correct?
Right. So right, you're correct, Commissioner Notch. A quick background on pumping companies or maintenance companies. So Stearns County, we don't have a septic ordinance. We have a septic ordinance. So all the pumpers are regulated by the state of Minnesota. They have to keep records on who they pump, what volume they pumped out of their tanks. They have to, whether they're land applying it, they have to keep records on where it goes, what they limed it to, at what pH. So there's all those requirements that they're required to keep in order to land apply. Or if they don't land apply and they take it to a municipal waste treatment system, you know, they keep that record saying I dumped at the St. Cloud municipal plant, whatever. So, yeah, there's a lot of record keeping that goes into septic tank. That's for sure.
Mark, do the companies keep their individual records of the people they've pumped? Or could the company provide, if they pumped a bunch of residential dwellings or whatever they pumped in Stearns County, could they provide that from a company to the county?
I would think they should be able to. You know, they have to keep their listing on, like I said, where they pumped and how much their volumes and stuff. It would be just working with them to get them to submit that to us. I know a couple of years ago, Douglas County had gotten some money to do a kind of a software grant kind of thing. And what they did is they put into place kind of a neat program where they did a lot of that tracking. And I think they had an app that they were putting together that allowed a maintainer to dial into the app and say, I'm at this residence, I just pumped it, and I took, you know, this kind of thing. So that pumping record would get automatically submitted into the county records. So that was kind of a neat feature that they had done. I know they had worked with the University of Minnesota to get that put together, and it was kind of showcased in a number of the training sessions while they were working on it subsequently after. So, yeah, so, you know, looking at what our neighbors are doing, not getting too creative or reinventing the wheel. I saw what Benton County had in place, and I thought, well, that would be a potential good solution for Stearns County if we were looking to offer flexibility to these other establishments and getting, you know, basic holding tank permits out there in situations where maybe the Board of Adjustment would look at it and agree to issue a variance on it, but not have to bog down their agenda with the applications. So, so kind of looking at this then, you know, in a big picture perspective here, through the discussion, are amendments required to achieve the comprehensive plan goals and policies? If we answer yes, then we have to be looking at some sort of amendment language to our ordinance. You know, what should be considered then? If we say no, what we have in place meets our goals and policies, then I guess we're in a good place. But kind of hearing the feedback that was given through those sessions during the planning process, the thought being conveyed was that maybe there was some flexibility that could be achieved in these situations. So taking that into consideration, I guess my thought would be, in a little forward thinking, that anticipating this group may decide ordinance changes should be sought and amending language should be drafted for consideration. So with that, taking that forward, thinking a little more, I did take what the current ordinance says and kind of tweak it a bit to say, how can we offer flexibility to these types of businesses without getting too far from where we're at, kind of a thing. So looking at this, the first change that I would change would be that first statement. Change that or other establishments into non-dwelling situations or structures, excuse me, non-dwelling structures. The purpose for that would be just then to incorporate all non-dwelling structures, accessory structures that we talked about, the private sheds, the feedlot barns, the chicken barns, turkey barns situations, all the way into the small businesses or any of the businesses that would be considered another establishment. Looking at further suggestions, I would look to clarify item B there. It doesn't necessarily apply to the other establishment situations, but we'd offer some clarity and language to that as it relates to the pre-existing lots. And then from the original 6.5 section, you can see I shortened it from 8 down to actually 6. And in there, I added a criteria for low volume generators, which we'll look in the next slide. And then I also added in what I think Richard brought up earlier about the private shed in back with the floor drains and how we deal with those currently with the non-domestic waste that are part of section 2.3 of our ordinance. So I would I'd offer modifications to 6.51 this way, where it speaks to allow and then if we get into the final couple sections here, 6.5.2 wouldn't need any kind of modification unless there was concerns, the reinstatement of an operating permit or something for further oversight was necessary. We may add language in there, but then really the big switch would be adding 6.53 and identifying what a potential low volume generator is. And we could look at including A, B, and C, which were part of those original 8 that were previously allowed. So again, allowing for recreational camping vehicles on private lots, all toilets in public parks, and then privately owned privies. But then add in letter D and take that to non-dwelling structures that have maximum design flows of 75 gallons per day. As I kind of stated before, maybe 75 gallons per day is not the right number. There's conversation for that on what that gallons per day should be, given what some of our neighboring counties have. But if we label it as non-dwelling structures rather than other establishments, it kind of combines in the residential accessory structures, the agricultural accessory structures that maybe have a convenience toilet and sink in them. It also allows then the feedlots, meaning turkey barns, chicken barns that are out there and have nothing but impervious surface all the way around them, and there's no room for a drain field to be installed. But then it also, like I said, opens up the opportunity to also include in and offer that flexibility some of these smaller businesses that are out in that rural area. Maybe it is that 4-person cabinet shop or two-person butcher shop or whatever it is, where they have a toilet and a sink in it for their use. That would be a straight up permittable use at that point and alleviate the request to the Board of Adjustment. So, anyone have any thoughts on that suggestion?
Well, Mark, Jeff Bertram, I think that all makes sense. The 75 gallons per day, just based on what you said before with some of those other counties, you probably should look at, 100 or 150 to allow a little flexibility. But based on everything you've said, that would alleviate the 14 variance applications pretty much and what we've approved at the Planning Commission level. So I think the draft language, and the only thing I would suggest is a increase in the gallons per day to allow a little flexibility. And I like Benton County. A lot of this is Benton County. I like that as well. But the only thing I didn't care for was specifically saying a sink, a toilet, a shower. You know, getting specific what they have is less important than the water, the gallons per day, in my opinion. So I think this reflects that. The only change I would suggest is increasing the gallons per day.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. I agree that maybe that 75 is too low. If you went to 150 gallons per day, that would get you up to like a business with about 8 employees, which is starting to be a fairly decent sized rural business. Also, when you look at that flow, then too, if you take the 150 gallons per day and multiply it by that factor of 5 for your tanking size, you're still under that magical 1,000 gallon mark. And I say that just because the way tanks are built. Manufacturers make tanks in certain volume sizes, 625. Then they get up to the 1,000, 1,250, 1,200, 1,250. So there's certain sizes. So even at that 150 gallon per day size or allotment for flow, you would still be at under that 1,000 gallon, which you wouldn't have to go to an oversized tank. However, a lot of holding tank situations, I'm an advocate of saying 1,000 gallon might be the minimum size tanking needed, just based on what kind of tank's available. But really, you should look to maybe a 2,000 gallon tank or something, just so that you can push off your pumpings longer. And then when you do pump it, you're sending the truck away with a full tank because you're paying for them to show up. So you might as well get the best bang for your buck there. So.
See, Mark, Rich here. I agree with Jeff on all of this. This looks pretty good. And yeah, double that gallons per day. I think that would just make it easier for a person in business to operate. And so they might only have 3-4 employees, but who knows, you may have a customer stop by here and there. So that might increase that need for capacity.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Anyone else?
Jeff Bergen, I agreed. Also, I do need to leave now.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Morgan. Any other thoughts or comments?
This is Sean. Yeah, I like it. And I agree with the 150 gallons per day on that, to change that up.
I think if we went there, Sean, you would definitely see a reduction in the number of requests to the Board of Adjustments.
I think that's a pretty indication that we're going to make adjustments. And I appreciate everybody's comments and concerns, and we'll bring those forward in an ordinance amendment. I don't know a date for the public hearing yet, but we'll work on that. Anything else you guys want to talk about? As Mark, thank you, Mark, for putting up that slide. The next meeting is March 29th, 6 p.m. We're going to go through the platting requirements, township plat approval, and certificate of survey requirements.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I appreciate everyone's time and input this afternoon and into this early evening. Any other thoughts before we wrap this up and bid each other farewell? Annie?
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
All right,
you.
Everyone, thanks
very much.